Okay, and we're recording. Thank you. Good. It's going. Okay. Okay, so we've done we've sort of finished up philosophy of mind. We looked at some objections to physicalism, right? Where physicalism is what most philosophers are after, somehow making our scientific understanding of the world compatible with our everyday understanding of ourselves, right? That's sort of been the approach in many cases, where we want to be able to fit ourselves into the overall scientific picture of a world that is ultimately reduced down to basic elements, right? Whether it's atoms or perhaps at some deeper level, something else, right? How atoms work. But at there's some sense in which everything is reducible down to just basic natural elements, right? That's the basic idea here. So the attempt is to get away from any kind of dualism to a purely physicalist or at least naturalist understanding of the human mind, and as something that is a function of the brain, right? That's been the project for many philosophers of mind in the 20th and 21st century. And then there are some philosophers that we looked at who think of that project is just doomed from the get-go, because one of the main characteristics of a mind is, at least in human beings, is consciousness. And these philosophers think that consciousness can never be reduced down to just a biological function. And they think it's something else, something more special than that. Um, what it is, well, it depends on who you're talking to, right? Some people will go back to Descartes, to some sort of dualism. Some people adopt panpsychism. Some people adopt what's called new Mysterianism, which is you're not really making a statement about what the mind is like, but you're just skeptical that a scientific framework would ever make any sense out of it, right? That's also a possibility. Okay. Well, we spent a lot of time in all this, so we'll move on. Although many of the problems will arise again, right? So depending on what kind of take you have on the mind, you might have a different kind of take on the question of free will and determinism, right? Depending on what your starting premises are, right? So we'll look into that. So to introduce this topic, here's a painting. Can anyone guess what's being depicted in this painting? What's happening here? This little scene? Anybody know? I'll wait a couple of seconds here. See if anyone wants to chime in. You see that's an angel, two humans, a male and a female. An angel is seems to be ejecting them from somewhere. Yes, it's Adam and Eve. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. There's a snake there even. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this comes from the Old Testament, right? This comes from Genesis. It's one of the first stories in the Bible. Um, People have different takes on how to interpret it, right? Some people just think it's just fairy tales because religion is nonsense. Some people think it's not just fairy tales. It's religiously important, and it contains some sort of divine truth, but it should not be taken literally. Or some people take it very, very literally and think that this is an event that actually happened. But in either case, when the question of suffering in the world comes up, okay, this is going to come up again when we do philosophy of religion. When the question of why there is so much suffering in the world, why there is so much pain and anguish, and I don't just mean your personal little tribulations, though you may personally have had giant tribulations, but it's also, just at this huge scale. If you think about just the fact that children's hospitals exist, children's hospitals for terminally ill children, right? So children who are just expected to die uh, as children, that sort of thing. War, pestilence, disease, earthquakes, just all the terrible things that happen in life. And people say, how would that be if there's a good, benevolent God? If there's a good guy who is all powerful and cares about our well-being, then why would this being not step in and do something? Right? That's part of the problem, right? Part of the problem of evil and suffering. The response to this is usually something along the lines of, well, God created a perfect world, okay? Everything was nice and peachy and great and beautiful. But God also gave human beings free will. Right? God did not. So I'm just telling you what a typical story is, right? I'm not telling you this is correct, and I'm not saying it's the only approach, but it's a very common Christian or generally theistic way of dealing with this problem of evil, is to say God created human beings with free will. Because it's better to create a creature with free will that can freely choose to love and obey and worship you, as opposed to just some sort of robot that God just created to love him. That somehow seems less meaningful. You kind of get that it's kind of anthropomorphizing God a little bit, right? But it's would you rather have a person in your life who loves you because of their own accord, or would you want to create a robot that says all the right things? Well, you want someone to, you don't want it to be programmed into someone to love you or to worship you as God wants to be worshipped. So the whole idea is that God created human beings with free will, and then we can simply choose. We can choose whether or not we want a good relationship with the divine being that created us or not. Right? If we love this being, then we'll want to obey it. We'll want to do what the being tells us. Right? We'll want to worship the being. That means we want to listen to it and not to some other being. Right? So that's the whole idea. God gave human beings. We can represent them with Adam and Eve, right? You could take this literally or symbolically. Either way, it means something like God created human beings and gave us free will. But there's a price to pay for free will, which is if you use your free will in a way that God did not like you to do, but did give you the choice, then bad things will happen, right? So the whole idea is that all the suffering that we see in the world today, if we take the story literally, it's something like, well, Adam and Eve chose to disobey God with their free will. Right? And it is because of that they got kicked out of paradise, and it is because of that. And even if you read the actual Genesis account, it'll mention this. It'll mention the fallout of this. There'll be repercussions of it, right? God cursed the snake, for one, right? To crawl around on its belly, implying that before this, snakes had legs, right? That's the implication. A lot of these old stories are also what are called etiological tales, where they explain the origin of something that we see in the world, right? So part of this is to explain, why do we hate snakes? Why are they so creepy and crawl around on their belly? Well, God cursed the snakes, and he forever set us up with this adversarial relationship with snakes, because snakes were the ones that tricked Adam and Eve into disobeying God. Right. That's one of the repercussions, one of the curses that has befallen God's creation as a result of mankind's free will decision to disobey God. Another one is that men are now supposed to go out and toil the earth, right? Work on the earth, basically meaning work, bring home food, do all that. You have to actually work and have a hard life and put your hands into the earth and work hard labor. This has been a theme of mankind for millennia, right? This hard work. We don't like to do all this hard work. Why can't we just live in paradise? Why can't everything just be fun and nice all the time? Well, here's why. God cursed us because we disobeyed him. Why do women feel pain, extreme pain during labor? Which I can attest to. I was there for the birth of both of my children, and I had to do some of the coaching and all that stuff. An incredible amount of pain that often causes the women who are giving birth to almost disassociate from their bodies. The Bible says that this is another curse that God put into women for disobeying God. Right? Those are just three examples, but the overall apologetic, as it's called, is that any kind of suffering that you see in the world is simply a result of our free will. Right? So free will is very important in this way of looking at things, right? Because then you have to ask the question: does that make sense? Do we have free will in such a sense that we would have this sort of these cosmic consequences attached to them? Does it make sense, for example, to think that because there was this snake that was telling lies to Eve, supposedly telling lies, that therefore now thousands, however you want to do the math on this, right, depending how literally you take the story, thousands or tens or thousands or hundreds of thousands years later, now little 8-year-old Jimmy has cancer, right? That's part of the story here, that this is all a direct result of human beings using free will to choose from amongst different options. Some of those options are better than others because they were created that way by God, right? And some are worse. And if we freely choose something, then we have to just deal with the consequences, and it makes sense, right? So I just wanted to bring up that little that bit of mythology. And again, when I say mythology, it does not mean a false story. The word mythology does not mean that. It means something like, a narrative that encapsulates certain values or fundamental truths in a symbolic way. Okay, so certainly the Bible counts as mythology in that sense. They are narratives, and they embody certain values that they are then passed on to the people that it's being communicated to. The narratives might be true or false. Right? We don't know. That part of it doesn't really matter. It's a little bit like mythology. You can understand mythology also in that famous story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and then being confronted about it. And George Washington, what does he say? "Sir, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, it was me that cut down the cherry tree." Right? This is supposed to embody the value of honesty. It's supposed to be an all-American kind of value, being an honest, upright person. So yes, you can mess up, but you can tell the truth later and rectify it. Right? So it's a little bit of a morality kind of a story. This story did not appear until way later, and it was probably a fictional story. Right? It probably didn't really happen. But what if it did? So what? Right? What do we have now is mythology. Now people tell that story to try to explain that honesty is an important virtue. Right? So that's what makes it mythology, not whether it's true or false. Okay, I just wanted to flag that. So the Genesis account of Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden, it's mythology, and it's supposed to encapsulate certain values and certain truths about the human condition. And one of those things has to do with free will. So let us look at free will, right? Why does it make sense to say that it's because of free will that there's suffering in the world? Okay. Now, we're not going to spend much time on the question of suffering here in this section. We will revisit this when we talk about the existence of God in the next section. For right now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the concept of free will. What do we mean by that anyway, right? We're going to look at some maybe definitions or at least examples of what we think of as free will. And then we're going to look at the way in which free will is tied to morality. Right? By morality, I just mean saying that someone is morally blameworthy for something or morally praiseworthy for something, right? That someone did something that's good, or someone did something that's bad, or someone did something that's good or evil, right? We make these kinds of moral judgments a lot. Now, we're going to look later on in the semester, we'll look at the phenomena of morality more closely. But here, we just want to look at the link in our everyday practices of assigning moral blame and moral praise, and the way that it goes along with our concept of free will. Because notice, we don't blame someone for something that was not done of their own free will, right? We'll look at examples of that, but just as a quick way of getting it in your head. Right? If somebody accuses you of something, you say, well, that was an accident. It's different from, well, I meant to do that, right? I did it of my own free will. So free will and morality are tied in that way. We'll look at that first. Then we'll look at the concept of determinism. Okay. Now, for many people who are a little bit familiar with this debate, they think that it's a debate between free will and determinism, but it isn't necessarily. The way that determinism is defined, it does not automatically mean that there's no free will. There are slightly different concepts, slightly different things that we're trying to describe. It may look that way, but I want you to keep that intuition, that reaction in check, right? First, we'll look at free will on its own. Then we'll look at determinism on its own. Then we will look at different ways of thinking about both. Right? So then incompatibilism is the view that they can't both be true. Determinism and free will cannot both be true. That's an incompatibilist says that. Right? And if you're an incompatibilist, then you can choose. Is free will true or is determinism true? Determinism, by the way, I will define that as well when we get there. But you know how I like to do this. I like to quickly sketch everything ahead and then go into detail. Determinism is the idea that everything is determined, right? Every event that happens has a set of causes that are enough to necessitate that event to happen, right? So, if I have this mic that I'm using, I do a mic drop, right, and it falls down, there is some set of causes to that. There's the gravitational pull. There's the fact that I'm no longer holding it. Right? There's a set of causes that, since they are there, that's enough to produce the effect. And determinism is the idea that everything that happens in the world is just the effect of previous causes. Right? Now you can see how you might start thinking, well, what does that mean for free will then, right? That's the whole idea. Is if everything is determined by prior causes, then your decisions or your own bodily movements, whatever they are simply the result of previous physical or perhaps psychological processes. That seems to destroy the possibility of free will, right? So that's why many people become incompatibilists, and it just depends on which one you think is true then, right? If you think free will exists, and you're an incompatibilist, then you think determinism is false. Right? Then that makes you a libertarian. This is not libertarian in the political sense, right? It does not mean a libertarian like sometimes you have a third party, libertarianism in politics. It doesn't mean that at all. It has the same root. The root word is liberty, freedom, right? So a libertarian in philosophy is someone who believes that we have genuine free will and determinism is false. A hard determinist is someone who says, sorry, nope, determinism is actually true. Everything actually is caused. Everything is the effect of previous physical processes or other kinds of processes. Therefore, we do not have free will. Right? So the libertarian and the hard determinist both agree you can't have determinism and free will. Only one of them is true. Right? So if you are like that, you might ask yourself, are you a hard determinist or a libertarian? Right? But there is another option, compatibilism. Compatibilism says that free will and determinism can coexist together. That free will is not negated by the truth of determinism. Okay? So that's the general structure of what we're going to look at. So let's first look at free will. I've resisted the urge here to come up with one overall definition. Okay? I know that this is what Socrates always wanted, right? Is to have a definition that lists all the sufficient and necessary conditions for any term. Well, I think that's a mistake anyway. Socrates was kind of an essentialist who thought that every word had some sort of essential definition, which I just don't think is true. I think many concepts are more like bald, right? We've talked about this before, right? The word bald makes sense.
Fine. Okay, but if I start plucking out hairs, at what point do I become bald? Is there an official line that we draw? No, there's not. Many of our concepts have fuzzy boundaries. Okay, um, so many of our everyday concepts might not be able to be defined in this very strict way that Socrates seemed to be after, right? Or Plato seemed to be after when he thought that we should grasp the essence of something. Right? Since the early 20th century, with philosophers like Wittgenstein especially, there's been a lot of debate and talk about this. So Wittgenstein famously argued against essentialism, and he said that's just not how languages work. Okay, he thought that we can have lots of concepts in everyday contexts that have a use and an application, but it's not entirely well defined whether or not this or that counts as an X or not. So many of these Socratic questions, what is X really? What is justice really? They might not have an answer in terms of a strict list of sufficient and necessary conditions. Not all concepts are like triangles. Not all concepts are like bachelors. Right? Triangles, bachelors, easy to define. They're crisp and clear boundaries. Right? Many concepts might not be like that. Free will might be not be like that either. So I'm going to look at free will and just mention some of the things that we associate with that, without saying that this is a final definition. Okay, so it's more like giving a variety of examples. One of the things that we associate with free will is that we have some alternatives in front of us, some alternative choices, and we're not being compelled by anyone to make that choice. We're not being forced to make the choice. Right? So, for example, if you enlist in the army, right, you haven't been drafted, nobody put a gun to your head, but you are thinking about what to do with your life, and you think, okay, well, I've got all these different options. I could go to college, I could go to trade school, I could just get an entry job at McDonald's, I could become a drug addict and live in the streets. Yeah, I've got lots of choices. Oh, but I could also join the army. Let me think about this. You think about it for a while, and you think, yes, I want to do this, right? And maybe you talk to a lot of people about it. Maybe not everyone agrees with your decision, but hey, it was your decision. You didn't have to choose that. You could have chosen many different alternatives. So if you enlist in the army in that kind of scenario, it feels natural to say, oh, they did it of their own free will. Nobody forced them to do it, and there were multiple alternatives. Right? It wasn't as though enlisting in the army was the only choice. Right? That's the important thing here: is that there are multiple choices, and you're not being forced into any one of them. Also, the idea is that you're in control of the action. That a free will action is one that you are controlling without outside interference. In other words, it's a voluntary action. Right? So that means a sneeze, for example, is not usually a free will action. Sneezes in many cases are just spontaneous and they just happen, right? Or other bodily responses that you might have. You don't normally control your heart rate, right? It's possible to do this sort of thing, but for some people, apparently, I don't know. But you could take some degree of control over your autonomic responses, but for the most part, your body is constantly doing all sorts of stuff that you are not actually directly in control of, right? You are not willing that oxygen molecule that just went into your bloodstream to go to this cell, right? You're not in charge of that, right? Your body's autonomic responses are in charge of that. But you are in control of lots of other actions, right? So I could decide to raise my left or my right. I could make that decision. Nobody's compelling me to do that. I'm the one controlling it. I'm not saying, oh, wait, I didn't want that one to go up, right? No, not that one. No, none of that, right? I'm in control. Right? That's something else that we mean by free will. Because if you're not in control of the action, it is not normally considered a free will action. Does that make sense? Now, you could come up with weird layers to this, right? For example, if you're really drunk and you get in a car and you're blackout drunk and you're driving, You're not exactly meaning to do anything, right? You're not intending to get into a car accident. You're not really in control of your actions anymore, but you were in control of the action that incapacitated you, right? You're in control of drinking, right? Your drinking amount. You were in charge of that. So sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, but all in all, if something is completely beyond your control, then we don't call that a free will action, right? So there are some weird cases like getting drunk, but there we can say you were at least in charge of the initial decision to drink and then to keep drinking, right? So we still would say, well, there's some free will involved there to some extent, right? But just acknowledging that there are weird cases. But for the most part, we would want to say if an action is a free will action, it's one that is voluntary, that it was caused by you, that you meant to do, right? We could say it in a different way. But many of these things are sort of overlapping, right? That's why I'm saying I'm not giving one definition. I'm just giving sort of different angles on free will, and you can see how they all sort of go together, right? You meant to do the action. It was deliberate. It was on purpose, right? Meaning you formed an intention and then you acted, right? It's that whole thing that we talked about in philosophy of mind, right? How there's a link between our mental states and our behavior, right? A link between input from the environment, then that creates a mental state, and then the mental states. Some mental states result in behavior, right? So, for example, an intention to go for a walk, when that actually results in going for a walk, it's a free will action. Right? You're meaning to do it. It was not just an accident, right? Like a burglar. We hold burglars responsible because they came up with a plan, right? They meant to rip you off and go into your house and do all that stuff, right? There's jokes about people just tripping and falling and this kind of bad stuff happening. It doesn't happen like that, right? Burglars don't just trip and accidentally end up robbing you. No, it was something that they thought of beforehand, right? They deliberated over it. They made a decision. Okay. And then finally, this is the just to warn you ahead of time. This final one, I'm convinced that this is what the whole debate is about. It depends on how you interpret this statement. So this one especially is going to come back. Okay. It's the idea that you have alternate possibilities. It kind of goes along with the first one, but that has to do with more with the alternatives that are out there. This has to do with the fact that you could have done a different action, right? You could have done a different action than the one that you did. So that's the idea that human beings having free will means that they have alternate possibilities. They could have done other than what they chose to do. So if we're thinking about Adam and Eve, right? Oh, I should mention, by the way, I didn't even tell the whole story because I assume everybody knows, but that's not the case anymore. Right? The whole thing was that God planted a tree in paradise amongst all the other trees, and God told Adam and Eve, you can eat any of the other trees, but don't you eat from that one, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's a lot of debate about what that term actually means, the knowledge of good and evil. There's no real consensus on it. But that was the idea. There's a special tree. God said, don't eat from that. If you eat from it, you'll die, right? If you read it in a certain way, it actually looks like God is saying the fruit is poisonous, right? And because that makes a whole lot more sense then. No, not anymore. I mean, I could go back, but it's kind of annoying. Are you seeing the correct thing? Wait, what are you seeing? You're still seeing Adam and Eve?
Yeah, the Adam and Eve slides went on for me.
Oh, that's weird. No, maybe sign out and back in. Is anyone else having that problem? Yeah, Parker is seeing the right thing. What do we mean by free will is the page that we're on. Sometimes it helps to log out and back in.
I can catch up on the video. I mean, I'm right now, so I just, it's just like,
Okay.
doing things. I'm like, this is weird. All right, cool. I'm out. I'll be back.
Okay. Okay. So everybody else can see it. Okay. So to continue the Adam and Eve story, God says, "Don't eat the fruit." Kind of sounds like God is saying the fruit is poisonous. Then the snake says, "No, it's actually good for you. It actually tastes really good, and you'll be able to see the difference. You'll be able to know everything just like God." Right? And then Eve gives in, takes a bite of the apple, shares it with Adam, and now we have child cancer. Sorry to be flippant about it, right? I'm not being flippant. Actually, it's a big problem, right? And sometimes you just have to say it, right? So I'm not being flippant about it, but it is part of the whole story, right? It's a big part of the package. So the idea is that, let's say Adam and Eve, right, for that to be a free will action, right, choosing to disobey God and eating the fruit, for that to be a free will action, it has to be the case that they could have done something other than that. They could have done some other action. Now, what does that mean? They could have done something else, right? Imagine the psychological profile that Adam and Eve, if you're going to take them literally, what psychological profile did they have at that moment? Can you really imagine rewinding time to that crucial moment where there's Eve with her mind, with her preferences, with her set of beliefs about the world, confronting this snake that says you should eat the apple? Now, if she freely chose to do that, then that means that her actions were the result of her own intentions, and her own intentions were based on her overall psychological profile, which is based on her preferences, her beliefs about the world, her desires, all that. So then, what does it mean that she could have done otherwise? Because on the one hand, you'd want to say she couldn't have done otherwise because that's who she was at that moment, right? That's where her mind was at that moment. Her decision was based on her preferences, her desires, her beliefs. Those were her preferences, her desires, and her beliefs. So of course, if you rewind time, Eve will make the exact same decision every time, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to say, no, if we have free will, that means when you rewind time, Eve might have made a different choice. She might have made the better choice. Yeah. So we're going to revisit that, this idea of rewinding time, right? Because what does it mean to say you could have done other than what you did? Think about it yourself. Put yourself back in a crucial decision moment that you had. Now, of course, you could say, I could have done something different if I had been a different kind of person. If I had different desires, or if I had different beliefs about the world, I could have made a different choice. But, right, rewind back to that crucial moment. What kind of person were you at that moment? Right? On that view, you might say that your action is the inevitable result of the kind of person that you were at that moment. That person is the kind of person who would make that decision. So if you rewind time, you're still that person. There's no reason to think that you could have chosen something different. Right? So could have chosen different. What does it mean? You could have chosen different if you rewind time and everything is exactly the same. You are exactly the same, but somehow you chose a different outcome, a different behavior? Or does it mean you could have done otherwise if you had different desires? Meaning there were other options available, right? And if you had desired a different option, you could have chosen that option. Okay? So there are two different ways of understanding you could have done otherwise. Yes? Is this making sense? I'll say it one more time. This idea of alternate possibilities, which seems so crucial intuitively to the idea of free will. Right? It's the idea that for any free will action, you could have done otherwise than what you chose to do. What does that mean? Does that mean, one, if we rewind time and line everything up exactly the same right before that crucial decision. So you still have all the same thoughts going on in your head. Could you conceivably have made a different choice and that would still be considered a free will action? Or does it mean if you rewind time and you slightly change your psychological profile, you slightly change what you want or what you think is real and so on, then you could have chosen something different? Two different ways of interpreting alternate possibilities. This is not clear yet. We'll talk about that more later. Okay, I just wanted to flag that. Right. So the army example is simply, yeah, you could have chosen not to enlist in the army, right? But again, imagine this person who, right, they're about to sign the thing that gets them put in the army. And they've been thinking about this for months and months and talked about it to people. And here they are, ready to sign it. They've made up their mind. And they say, yes, I want to sign it. Boom. And they sign it. Now rewind time. What's going to happen? Right? The person's there, again, with the exact same mindset. Have been thinking about it for months. Has made up their mind to do it. There they are, about to write their signature in the exact same frame of mind as before. Could they conceivably make a different choice? That's one way of interpreting it. The other way is, if they were there and they've been talking about it, then maybe they made up their mind beforehand, but just as they're sitting there, something different happened. Maybe something came on the radio and they heard some bad thing about a war. Right? Something slightly different happened. And now they've got something else to think about. Now, could they choose to, after all, not sign it and walk out? Yes, if that's what they had come up with instead, if that was the decision instead. But notice, we would have had to rewind time and change the circumstances slightly. That's the only way on that reading of it that they could have done otherwise. Okay, so 4 basic kind of things that we'll want to refer back to when we're theorizing about free will and determinism. What does determinism, for example, say about the first one? What does determinism say about the second one? What does determinism say about the third one? Right? These sort of loose ways of indicating that something might be a free will action. So we don't have to be really rigid about it. It's rather, when we look at determinism, what does determinism entail for some of these basic things that we tend to intuitively associate with free will actions, right? Okay, good so far. Did anyone want to expand or give their definition of free will? Is there something here that you would like to be on there? Is there something that's being left out? Notice some of these are kind of rewordings of the other ones. I just wanted to come at it from slightly different angles so you get a kind of a picture rather than an oversimplified definition, right? Which can be problematic. Are there conditions for what can have free will? Yeah, I imagine there would be, but it would just be anything that's capable of these 4 things, right? Yeah. So do animals have free will? That's hard, right? If I were to get pushed out of a plane, is my free will? Yeah, if you are doing something that you did not choose to do, that was not the result of your own desires, that's in fact conflicting with what you want to do, then that would be, on the definition that we just gave, that would be a violation of your own free will, right? Because you are flying out of an airplane, falling out of an airplane, and that was not a free will decision. So yes, that's good, exactly, yeah. Conditions for what can have free will, yeah, that's a little more difficult. I mean, it looks like you have to be a person. And in philosophy, person does not mean a Homo sapien. Person is more kind of a functionalist understanding of what a person is, right? So a person is someone with rationality, with intentions, the ability to base an action on a thought process that you had, the ability to deliberate about your actions, right? So you're not simply acting instinctively. So it's hard to say if dogs have any free will, but at least a fly does not, right? So it does not think about its environment in abstract terms or make decisions in that way. They just sort of buzz around. They do what they do. You have to be a person to have free will. So that could be an alien, that could be an angel, right? It could be a ghost. Yeah. How can you clearly differentiate instinct from intention? Yeah, you might not be able to, right? So, yeah, when we talk about intentions, this is all going to become a little bit more clear in the compatibilist version. The compatibilist says, look, if the action is a result of your intention, that's all it takes. That intention, however, there's a causal story to be told. You know, that intention was not necessarily chosen by you. Right? That intention was itself produced by a bunch of autonomic instinctual responses. So you probably can't completely differentiate instinct from intention, except in the sense that, you know, an intention is something where you find yourself, at least introspectively, believing that your action is the result of some sort of idea that you formed in your mind based on your going through your preferences and your values. You know, if you've actually deliberated this, it's the result of a deliberative, rational process rather than an automatic bodily one. So to the extent that we can make that distinction, I feel like it's an okay distinction. But of course, if determinism is right, if physicalism is right, it all still just boils down to, here's a biological machine that simply does what it does. Yeah. Jellyfish functions on pure instinct. Yeah, probably. You know, I don't know. Jellyfish are weird, right? They're rather smart, and they apparently can think multiple steps ahead in a reasoning process. So I don't know. I don't know whether to call that free will or not. I vaguely recollect some studies about jellyfish, or maybe no, not jellyfish. No, I think it's octopus or squid, not jellyfish. I'm sorry. I just imagined the thing in my head and immediately went to octopus or squid. Yeah, but there are some of these aquatic life forms that are highly intelligent. Yes, exactly. Sorry, I just pictured a jellyfish as an octopus. That happens. Something in my brain going wrong. So that's an interesting question. Yeah, to the extent to which other life forms have free will. Very interesting question. It's hard to really answer that. It's going to depend on your definition of free will, of course, right? The very libertarian definition of free will usually goes along with the idea of a soul, right? Again, some of these concepts all go together, right? God, soul, free will. So on a very classic view, God gave human beings souls, and part of what defines a soul is the ability to make free will choices. And if other animals don't have souls, then they don't have that. But if you have a compatibilist definition or another definition of free will, possibly some animals might be able to. It just depends on whether we think they can really form intentions and whether we think they can really deliberate at an abstract level about which possible courses of actions to take. You know. Okay, so let's quickly explore the link between free will and moral responsibility. You don't have to have any kind of take on morality for this. Right? So you don't have to think, well, morality is all subjective, or morality is all relative, or morality is what God says it is, or morality is making sure you maximize happiness over suffering, or you don't have to worry about any of that yet. We will later. For right now, you can just think about our ordinary everyday practices. How do we, as human beings, often decide whether or not someone is morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy or morally blameless, right? how do we distinguish that? One way that we do it is we think about whether or not someone had a particular reason that they had in mind for acting that way, or was the behavior simply caused by something outside of this rational sphere of looking at reasons for behaving. Silly example here, right? Imagine a person walks up to somebody, stands in front of him, and suddenly goes, whack, right across the face. We'd all be taken aback, right? We all wonder, what is going on here, right? Well, if this person says, yeah, I did it, I don't like your face, they're telling us a reason, right? They're saying, yes, I went through the options. I saw your face. I didn't like it. I thought, I want to slap your face. I want to slap that face right there, and I'm going to do it. And then I did it. Most of us would understand, at least, if someone were to say, well, that's a bad guy, right? That's a bad person. You don't just go walking around slapping people. That's bad, right? You might think of that as a paradigm example. If anything is immoral at all, you shouldn't go around physically assaulting innocent people just because you don't like their face, right? If it means anything at all to say that something is moral or immoral. Pretty good example. And again, it's because we take the person themselves to be the originator of that action. Right? It's the result of some sort of rational deliberation. And they said it, right? I did it. I meant to do it. I don't like your face. That's why I did it. Right? They gave you a reason. As opposed to, oh, I'm so sorry, I have a neurological condition, and sometimes my muscles spasm in an unpredictable way. And every now and then, I've got this under control, but every now and then it goes like this. That's conceivable, right? People do have these sorts of issues. So suppose the person's telling the truth. Do we hold that person to be morally accountable the same way as that first person? Probably not, right? If it's truly someone's medical condition that caused them to involuntarily have this outburst that accidentally hits somebody, even if we're kind of mad about it, it's at least not the same thing as somebody just not liking the look of your face and slapping you. This is just one silly example, but you can think about other examples like that as well, right? It's never as bad if something is not at all the result of the person's own will, the person's own desire, right? If it's some uncontrollable aspect to it that caused you to behave in that way, then we don't assign moral responsibility, at least not in the same way or to the same degree as with someone who totally meant to do it. You see that? So there's a link here between how we assign moral blame. Did they do it of their own free will or not? Right? If they did it of their own free will, it means they come up with a reason to do it and they're acting on that intention. If it's not free will, it's because of something outside of that, outside of their own decision-making process. Something like your muscles just not behaving as they're supposed to. Having these muscle spasms that you have no control over. We wouldn't hold a person morally responsible for that. And so we assign blame and praise in that way, right? So that was a blameworthy example. What about a praiseworthy example? You have, let's say there's a cat stuck in a tree, and a person sees it and feels bad for the cat, and feels bad for the people that take care of the cat, and decides, okay, I gotta make this situation better. They climb the tree, they get the little kitten, let's make it a little kitten, more dramatic, and climb back down and bring it back to, maybe it's a little kid. Here's your kitten, little Timmy. I don't know why I gave them my name. That's a nice thing, right? Somebody took time out of their day, saw a bad situation that they wanted to make better. That's a nice thing. They were motivated by good reasons. And so then when they rescue the kitten and give it back to the little kid, everybody can applaud, right? Oh, yay, what a hero. Good person that does that. Nice. Yes. Yeah. Now imagine, same end result, but let's say it's somebody just high out of their minds on amphetamines, hallucinating, climbing up a tree, not being aware of the cat at all, half falling asleep on the tree, waking up. In the meantime, the cat had crawled into their pocket, and the person goes back down, and there's the kitten there that jumps out, and the family sees the kitten. They're grateful that the kitten got rescued, and maybe they're even grateful to the crackhead. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't say to the to the drug addict. But are we going to say, "Wow, what a jolly chap! What a great guy that was"? No, because that person did not mean to do any of that. Just accidentally rescued the kitten. Their free will was not involved in it at all. They didn't mean to rescue a kitten. It just happened, right? A difference there, right? So the way in which we assign moral blame and also moral praise, right? These depend on whether or not we take the person to have done it of their own free will. And free will can mean several things, right? That they meant to do it, that it wasn't just some uncontrollable behavior, it was actually the result of their own intentions, and they could have done something different than what they did. So this leads us to, we talked about alternate possibilities before. Important to keep these distinct. Alternate possibilities is the idea that free will requires alternate possibilities. The principle of alternate possibilities says that moral responsibility requires that your action could have been a different action, right? You are only morally responsible for an action if you could have done otherwise on this view. So this is not something you might agree with, but just of someone who chooses not to try saving the cat. Yeah, so if they see the cat and don't do anything about it, I think it'll probably depend, right? I mean, rescuing a cat is probably an example of what's called a supererogatory moral action, meaning that it's not something that we think is morally required. It's just morally really cool if you did it, right? So, if you think about something a little more extreme, for example, rescuing a drowning child who is perhaps in a relatively shallow lake where all you need to do is reach out your hand and drag them out. So if you see a child drowning and you just stand there doing nothing, yes, I think we would hold you morally accountable. We'd say you're kind of a moral monster, right? What kind of person are you that you can just sit there and see somebody drown, right? It's like that old what's the word I'm trying to think of? The old urban legend. Urban legend is the word I was trying to think of. Remember that In the Air Tonight, Phil Collins? I can feel it coming in. There's a famous story that supposedly Phil Collins saw his friend drowning, and this guy just stood by and did nothing, right? And then years later, supposedly Phil Collins wrote this song, In the Air Tonight, about that guy, and then invited him to come to his concert, to go to the first row, so that Phil Collins could then sing that song of moral indictment towards that person, right? It's all fabricated. None of that ever happened. But that's the idea, right? If you know of somebody who's just standing by while a child drowns and they could easily intervene, we would hold that person in low moral regard, right? As opposed to somebody who is there on the scene, but perhaps they are blind, right? Where there is no sort of link, there's no choice that they made. They didn't make a choice not to save the child because they don't know that the child is drowning, right? That would be a different kind of a thing. So again, we are making the distinction based on the person's free will. Yeah. And so if someone knows that something bad is happening that they could easily prevent but doesn't do it, we hold them morally accountable. If you don't, then it's not quite the same thing. Yeah. Okay, so the principle of alternate possibility, it's basically saying, well, that's the real link between free will and morality, right? You're only morally responsible for something if you could have done otherwise. If there's no possible way you could have done anything but that, then yeah, how could we assign moral blame? Right? There's something intuitive about that. It's deceptive, I think, but go ahead and feel the intuitive pull of that, right? Think about that. If you honestly couldn't have done anything different than what you did at that moment, could you really be morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy? If that was the only option really available to you. You know? Again, like I said, there's two different ways of reading what alternate possibilities are, right? What it means for the possibility of an action possibly having been otherwise. Does that mean it could have been otherwise if we rewind time and leave everything exactly the same? Or do you mean it could have been otherwise if we rewind time and we jiggle things around a little bit? Right? Two different ways of interpreting it. Just to underscore that, let me give you an example. Okay, piece of paper. A ball might work better, but I don't have a ball with me. Okay, here's the pen. Okay, now we have a unique set of physical circumstances right here. I'm bending the paper a little bit. There's X gravitational pull, right? There's this angle. There's a certain roughness to the surface. This has a certain mass and shape and size. Put all those things together. Okay? This is where it landed. Right there on the keyboard. Now imagine we rewind time. And we have all the circumstances exactly the same. Right? Not just approximately the same like I do right now. Exactly the same. I think everyone would agree that it would fall exactly the same way, right? Someone's going to bring up quantum indeterminacy. If you are, let me just tell you, quantum indeterminacy does not have macro effects. So quantum indeterminacy will not affect the trajectory of the pen. Okay? That only happens at very small increments. This is pure Newtonian mechanics, where if we knew all the circumstances, we could predict exactly where it's going to fall. So if we rewind time, it'll do the exact same thing. This pen does not have alternate possibilities. If this is the setup, then it's going to have the same result every time, as long as the initial setup is exactly the same. So, does the pen have alternate possibilities? Not in that sense of if we rewind time and put it all in exactly the same way. No, it's always going to do the same thing. However, if I slightly change the angle, of course, then it's not determined that the pen is going to follow and not fall exactly in that spot. Right? No, then it's going to fall in that spot instead. It has alternate possibilities in that sense, right? That if you rewind time, but do a slightly different configuration of factors, physical factors, it's going to fall somewhere different. But if you rewind time and set everything up exactly the same, there's no alternate possibilities, right? I assume everybody agrees. So then the question is, what about human beings? Do we have alternate possibilities in the sense that you rewind time, change it slightly, you could do something different? Or do we have alternate possibilities in a sense that's completely different from the pen? That we could rewind time exactly the same, but unlike a pen, if we are in the exact same position, we could choose to veer some other way. That's part of the question here. Okay. Okay, any more questions about that? I mean, you can think about this yourself over the next few days, this link between free will and moral responsibility. We don't always use the word free will, right? But you can think about your own examples where you felt perhaps somebody else did something that was messed up. Perhaps you don't even use the words immoral because that has a bunch of connotations that people don't like. But you could be angry at a friend, right, or an acquaintance, or a significant other, or a family member. You might say, You didn't have to do that. You could have done this, right? Why did you choose to do this very inconsiderate thing? Nobody put a gun to your head and made you do that, right? You could have done something other than that. That's a very sort of everyday, natural way of arguing in that way. That we hold someone morally accountable when we think that their choice of action was not the right one, and in fact, they could have simply chosen to do the right thing. If you destroy that, the ability to make that distinction, the worry is, then there just wouldn't be any moral responsibility, right? So notice what this is, the principle of alternate possibilities is kind of setting us up. It's kind of saying, look, if free will does not involve alternate possibilities, then there's really no way to make claims about who's morally responsible for anything, because every action would be at the same level. Every action would simply be part of a deterministic causal chain, and there's no way to distinguish free will actions from non-free will actions, right? There would be no way to distinguish the slapping because of a neurological condition from the slapping because you meant to do it, right? There would be no difference between the drug-addled person rescuing the cat and the hero who saved the cat, right? If there's no alternate possibilities, then there's no free will. That's what this principle is saying. So I'm putting it up there not as a truth that everyone has to agree with, but this is part of the debate. This is part of what's been argued, is that it's an essential part of our moral decision making, our moral judgments, our moral practices, that we can understand the difference between someone doing something of their own free will and not of their own free will. And when they do something of their own free will, it means that they have alternate possibilities. Okay? All the while, you having to keep in mind that alternate possibilities can mean two different things, right? And we're just not going to decide which one it is quite yet. Okay, so now determinism. This is the big monster, right? This is the thing we're scared of because we'd like to continue using our folk concepts, right? Our folk morality, our folk psychology, where we're able to distinguish between free will actions and non-free will actions, and then dole out moral blame and praise accordingly. And that's only possible, supposedly, if our actions could have been otherwise, right? So if there's something that undermines any of those things, then that might be a little bit challenging, right? So determinism is like that. Right? Determinism, it's its own thing, and then we have to decide what does that mean for free will, right? Because this whole time that I talk about determinism, I'm not going to mention free will at all, right? So we're going to talk about determinism in its own terms, and then we'll have to decide. We'll have to do conceptual analysis. You'll have to decide, well, if that is true, what does that do for free will? It's not an automatic thing, as sometimes people assume. Sometimes people assume that determinism and free will have to be in conflict. They don't have to be, okay? So here's one argument for determinism. We've already looked at this argument. It's the idea that every event in the world has a sufficient cause, perhaps more broadly, a set of causes in the physical world, right? So again, there's the event of the pen falling right there on the keyboard. What caused that? Well, there's a unique set of events, right? There's the paper right here, there's my hand putting the pen here, there's the shape of the pen, there's the gravitational pull. All those things together, this happens. You put all the same things together every time, that will happen, right? That's what we mean by a sufficient cause. That means if you have all these same set of causes in place, you will always get the same physical result. It's a sufficient, meaning it's enough to bring about that effect. Okay? So the idea that everything in the world has some sort of explanation for it, but it's some sort of causal explanation where we can understand what's happening now in terms of what has just happened. Right? That all the things that just happen determine what's going to happen now. Another way to put this is, for any physical event. Let's call it Q. Q can stand for any physical event at all. Okay, that can mean the pencil falling. It can mean an earthquake. It can mean you making a decision, right? You choosing to go for a walk, right? You choosing to raise your hand. Any physical event at all. If P is the cause of Q, then Q necessarily follows P. In other words, if we're going to say that A caused B, then it has to be that B necessarily follows from A. That's what we mean on this, according to this anyway. That's what we mean by one causing the other. A causing B means that B necessarily follows from A. That if A happens, B must happen. So that means all physical states, physical events, physical processes, that includes human action, are causally necessitated by prior physical states. Basically, it's causal closure means that the physical universe is a closed system that doesn't need anything from the outside poking into it. Right? The universe as a physical system is self-contained, has its own laws that it obeys, and any event within that structure can be explained in terms of those universal laws and whatever happened right before it. So this is why we brought this up when we talked about souls, immaterial souls, right? If an intention is found in your immaterial soul, and that intention is translated into bodily behavior, we have a violation of causal closure, right? Because in that case, if my soul was causing me to raise my hand, that means that there's something outside of the physical universe that was causing me to raise my hand. That's why I call this idea that every human event would then be a miracle, right? Because every human decision, if it really started in an immaterial soul, would have some sort of effect in the physical world where that effect was not caused by something else in the physical world. But causal closure denies that. Causal closure says, no, the physical universe around us, all the planets at the macro scale, and then at this very micro scale where we exist, it's a closed physical system. Every physical event that happens, every atom that moves because some other atom moved and bumped into it, or whatever it may have been. There's some set of physical causes that brings about the next set of physical circumstances. Okay. Now, if you don't like physicalism, right? If you're a dualist or a panpsychist or whatever you may be, we don't have to cash it out in physical terms. We could just leave that word out and just say that, okay, well, at least every event, right? Maybe some events are non-physical, but it's at least trying to get you to intuitively agree that this must be the case, right? That if there's an event, there must have been some cause, right? Or more generally, a set of causes. But we could just call the set of causes the big cause, right? So, again, there are several different factors that determine where this pen is going to land, right? But if you put all those circumstances together, the pen will always land there. So every event has some sort of explanation, some sort of causal explanation that explains why that event is happening. Basically saying, right, the old chestnuts, everything happens for a reason. Now, of course, we have to be careful with that. A lot of times when people say everything happens for a reason, they mean that God or some other sort of intelligent being makes sure that whatever happens in your life, that there's some sort of good reason for it, that it allows you to grow as a person. That's not what we mean here, right? So again, everything happens for a reason, that can mean two things. It can mean all the bad things that happen in your life, they're just opportunities for you that God put there. That's one way of looking at it. That's not what we're saying here. Here we're saying everything happens for a reason. That means there are no uncaused events. There's no things that just pop into existence out of nowhere. Nothing just starts happening for no reason. If anything happens at all, it's because there's some sort of physical intervention, right? It's like this idea that an object in motion will stay in motion, right? Unless something hits it, unless something causes it to veer away from that, right? It's the same sort of thing. Anything different at all, anything that happens that we can look at that unique event over there. There must be some physical explanation for it, or at least there must be some causal explanation for it. Something caused that to happen, such that that cause necessitates it, right? Necessitates means it has to happen, given that you have those causes. Again, if all the causes are exactly the same, if the whole circumstance is exactly the same every time, the pen will fall in exactly the same spot every time. Change anything slightly, yeah, it'll fall differently, sure. But given that the pen fell here, and this is what caused it, then this set of causes necessitated it to fall there. In other words, determined it to fall there, right? When the pen lands there, it was completely determined that it would fall there because of the prior state of the world, right? Because this is what it was like a second before. Very closely related to this is sort of a philosophical argument, right? This is saying, well, it's almost a rationalistic argument. It's asking you to agree intuitively, right? I haven't really presented an argument for causal closure. It's supposed to be the sort of thing where you're just supposed to agree because the idea of an uncaused event is sort of unthinkable. Maybe it's not, but this is their idea, that intuitively you understand that every event must have a cause. And then you sort of think, well, given that cause, of course the event had to happen, right? So you're sort of starting with the general idea, events have causes, of course they do. And then you think, okay, given those causes, that event had to happen. It was determined. So that's how we get determinism out of this, right? So causal closure, this argument will only work if you agree with causal closure. If you agree with the idea that things happen for a reason, that every event has a cause or a set of causes. If you agree with that, then it does seem to lead to determinism, right? The idea that every event is determined by prior physical states. And that's essentially what the argument from physics says as well, right? It just does it a little bit differently. So the argument from physics would be, well, look, we've been talking about this a lot, right? All the stuff around you in the physical world composed of elementary particles. This has been a big theme of the whole course, of course, right? Ever since the pre-Socratics, we're looking for that underlying reality, right? The arche, the primal, basic stuff. Well, according to physics, the basic stuff is these elementary particles, and they obey physical laws, right? So all the stuff that composes everything, it's just a bunch of these atoms. And atoms behave according to very strict patterns. There's only certain things that atoms can do, and we can describe those in the language of physics. We can describe the behavior of atoms and how they behave, and we understand that those atoms themselves are completely determined, right? Those atoms, their behavior is completely dependent on what is happening around it and what kind of atom it is. It has no free will, obviously. Everything in the world is composed of elementary particles, and none of those elementary particles have free will. They all obey strict physical laws. Now, I had promised I wasn't going to say free will. I just made a mistake. It doesn't matter a whole lot. I was just being playful and saying that the atoms don't have free will. forget that for now. You can simply think about the fact that atoms obey these strict physical laws. Okay. So a little thought experiment. Philosophers love their thought experiment. Well, this is Laplace's thought experiment. Laplace was a physicist. 18th, early 19th century. He has this idea, well, let me go back to this first. Okay, you're getting sick of this example. It's just the idea that, look, okay, so we know that if the paper is crumpled up this way, and I have this angle, and this is the pen is this shape and mass, and the gravitational pull is XYZ, right? We know that it's going to go like this. Okay. Now, if you were sufficiently smart, if you knew all the rules, all the laws of physics, then you could predict ahead of time where that pen is going to fall. Right? If you were smart enough, right? You'd have to be very, very smart. You have to know exactly, you'd have to be like Mary, right? You have to be some sort of super scientist who knows more than any human could possibly know. But if you could know exactly what the initial conditions were, and the physical universal laws, right? The scientific laws that govern all these elementary particles, then you know exactly where it's going to land. Right, the butterfly effect. Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of claims about the butterfly effect, and it makes a lot of sense to me that a small action could have a huge consequence. I don't know about any systematic sort of empirical studies, right? Because it's ultimately an empirical claim. It's not something that I could think you could determine from the armchair. So there might be studies about this. I just don't know of them. But if you find something interesting on that, it would be cool. It makes a whole lot of sense to me that a small event might make a big difference, for sure. But I'm not quite sure. And here the idea is that if you were sufficiently smart or had enough knowledge, then you could know exactly how the butterfly effect would take place, right? You would know exactly how this small little action will determine something down the road, right? So Laplace's demon is like that. It's the thought experiment. It says, well, if you know enough about the world, the way that it is right now and the way that it was yesterday, and you know the physical laws that describe this, then you can predict what's going to happen tomorrow. Now, the predictability itself is not a big deal. Nobody can actually do this. This is not an argument that people can actually predict the future this way. It's just the idea that if you know everything right now and you know the laws of the universe, then you can simply predict what's going to happen next because only one option will be available, right? Because the future is completely determined by the present and the past. That's what it's supposed to show. So it's not supposed to show some sort of scientific ideal that we could somehow all know the future someday. It's not really about that. It's more a thought experiment to show, well, hey, yeah, that's right. If all the conditions right now are like this, and we have a complete knowledge of all the physical laws of the universe, then we would know that this is the only possible result, right? And again, this is like a small version of the whole entire universe, right? So if this is the initial conditions, and I know that physical objects behave such and such a way in these conditions, then I know where this is going to happen, and this is the only physical result that could have happened. The pen was determined to fall right there. The same thing would be true of the entire universe on this view, right? So that the states of all the elementary particles at T2 is completely explainable and determined by the state of all the elementary particles at T1, given the laws of physics, right? So you can imagine the whole world not as a world of discrete objects, but simply as a vast ocean of electrons or a vast ocean of atoms. That vast ocean of atoms, the state that it is in right now, combined with the laws of physics will determine exactly what the state of that ocean of atoms will be in the next moment. So T2 can only look like that given T1, right? So that means that a moment 10 seconds from now can only be like that given the way the world is right now. Did we just get there? I think we just got 10 minutes. No, not yet. Probably now. The way that everything is right now is completely determined by the way that everything was just a few seconds ago. Combined, of course, if we know the laws of the physics, the laws of physics that the universe obeys, assuming the universality of the rules, right? And maybe that's an assumption, but this is the basic idea, right? In the same way that if you knew enough about these initial circumstances, then we know that there can only be one outcome over here. The same thing is true of the universe in general. If these are the initial conditions right now, and these are the laws of the universe, then we know that the next second will just be that and not something else. Yeah. You can also think about this in a totally different way, to think about the A theory and B theory of time. Remember this? The idea that we think that every moment is real and all the other moments are not real, that only the present is real. Or you can think that all the moments are equally real, and you take this outside look at the universe, and you look at all the events that have happened, and you realize that the end result is just one big loaf of bread, and it just has those possibilities, or just has those events happening, right? You could look at individual human beings inside the bread loaf who have all sorts of ideas about what might happen, what could happen, but only one thing will happen, right? Which is kind of a funny thing when you think about, it's almost a more direct argument against any kind of free will, right? Well, not against compatibilist free will, as we'll see. But if you just think about it that way as well, right? That when it all comes down to it, the world is going to go one way, not the other, right? The story of your life, it's going to be one story where you did make that choice, and you did make that choice, and you did that, and you did that, and you did that, and not something else. Right? So in one real sense, it only is going to be one way, right? Okay, maybe those arguments were too abstract, or maybe you're just not impressed enough by science to really get on board with all that, or at least not impressed enough to just simply accept that. I personally think the argument from psychology is more convincing than any of the other ones. We've looked at this already, right? I gave you the belief-desire model of human behavior, where most of our intentional behavior is explained by what you believe about the world, rightly or wrongly, right? Some of those beliefs count as knowledge, some of them do not. What you believe about the world and your desires or your values, right? What are the things that you want out of life, or what are the sorts of values that you want to encapsulate in your life? Those are the things that determine your conscious, intentional behavior. Now, again, remember, when we're talking about free will actions, we're specifically talking about intentional behavior, things that you mean to do, right? This says that, well, yes, your conscious, intentional, voluntary behavior, why you choose to do the things you do, that depends on what kind of person you are. What do you believe the world is like? What are your desires? What are your values? What are your innate tendencies? What is your overall psychological profile, is the way that I like to call it, right? So psychological profile, I'll use that phrase sometimes. And I just mean just a snapshot of what you are like at a moment. What's your psychological profile right now, right? You may be feeling certain emotions, you may be feeling bored or hungry, but you also have just all the beliefs that you have that you're not thinking about, but you have this mental map of the world, and you have this hierarchy of desires and values, right? We talked about that a little bit, how you can have a hierarchy of desires and values. Right? You might have an overall value to always be loyal to your partner, but then people cheat, right? When they have a very strong desire to have relations with somebody else, right? You have this sort of battle between primal desires and some other values, but you can also have battles between primal desires, right? There's all sorts of ways that they can cash out. You can have a desire to do well in this class, but you also might have a desire to skip coming to these meetings, right? You might find it easier to not watch the videos. You might be tempted to do that. If this was a regular class, it'd be much more easy to give that as an example, right? You could say, well, you showed up. Sometimes you might be in bed and think, I really don't want to get out of bed, even though I want to get a good grade. We have these sort of battlegrounds of these internal desires and values. That's what explains your behavior, right? Why are you here today? Right? A lot of people showed up this time, which is great. Why are you here? Well, it's your psychological profile. It's whatever you end up thinking about this class, whatever you end up thinking about other things you could do, whatever you ended up thinking about grades, whatever you ended up thinking about, whatever it may have been, right? But if you are here intentionally of your own free will, or at least you're here intentionally because you consciously chose to, this is because of your psychological profile. It made sense. Given your psychological profile right before the class started, it would make sense that you would end up here as you are. But though your psychological profile itself, right, your beliefs and your desires, are ultimately out of your control. Now, I qualified with ultimately, okay? There's some sense in which you can take control of your beliefs and your desires. This is true. Right? When you take a philosophy class, for example, and your philosophy instructor encourages you to think about your mental map of the universe, to think about your beliefs about the nature of reality, then you are doing some sort of metacognitive cool stuff, right? You're taking charge of your own beliefs. Or if I tell you to study ethics and I have you think about moral situations, then you might start thinking about your desires and your values, and you might start doing that. Yes, that's true. You can do that, right, on this model. But ultimately, in the long run, whether or not you do any of that, that's out of your control. I'll get back to that in just a second, okay? I just wanted to flag that because someone will quickly say, well, no, my beliefs and desires are under my control. Yes, okay, but put a pin in that for one moment, okay? The idea here is the argument from psychology, right, is that what it is that you want to accomplish in the world, combined with your beliefs about how to do that, right, what the world is like, how you can best accomplish those goals, that's what explains your voluntary actions, right? So if I were to question you about any of the choices that you've made that you consider to be free will choices, if you believe in the concept of free will, then if we were to probe you deeply about that, and it turned out it really was an intentional thing, a conscious thing, not just based on a subconscious desire, right? Someone like Freud might say that, but let's suppose it's all on the level, you're aware of everything, and I ask you about why you made that decision, you are going to talk about what it is that you were trying to do, what it is that you were trying to accomplish when you did that action. What did you have in mind? What you have in mind, that's a psychological fact about you, right? That's something unique to your psychological profile. Even if you have a same general desire, it's going to be specific to your situation. And it's also going to depend on what you think the world is like. What's the best way to accomplish this goal? People often have very bad ideas. People might have good ideas about what to accomplish and then have very bad ideas about how to accomplish that. People might have very wrong and mistaken beliefs about the nature of reality. So even if they're intending something noble and good, they end up doing something terrible, right? That's the origin of the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Yeah, the intentions might all be there, but if you don't know what the world is like, you might end up making terrible mistakes. Anyway, the point here is just take any of your everyday voluntary actions that you don't think were compelled or anything like that. Well, they are the result of your unique psychological profile, but your unique psychological profile is ultimately determined by a few different factors that are actually outside of your control. Right? The easiest way to talk about this is just to talk about genetics and environment. So we know, I'm going to say this is an example of knowledge. We know about genetics and DNA. We know that DNA is the instruction manual for how to build your body. And that it also includes how to build your brain, what kind of brain you're going to have, what size brain you're going to have, how big of a temporal cortex you're going to have. It's going to determine problems that you might have. Look, I was genetically determined to have bad vision, right? Can't do nothing about that. I inherited those DNA, and now I have bad eyesight. This is going to have all sorts of impacts on your brain as well. So you're born into the world with a certain kind of brain, a unique brain. Every baby has a unique brain because every baby is uniquely genetic, right? Every genetic code is unique. So every single baby that's born is born with a slightly different body, a slightly different brain, into different circumstances. Okay? That is ultimately going to determine what kind of beliefs and desires you end up with. But those factors are beyond your control. You cannot control what your genetic makeup is, and you cannot control where you were born and the circumstances that you grew up in. But those two together will ultimately determine what kind of person you are. And so if you were to say, well, I am in charge of my beliefs and desires because I can actually now go in and check to see whether my beliefs are correct, whether I really want those desires. Yes, you can now take control of that. But whether or not you do so will depend on what kind of psychological profile you have right now. And that psychological profile is out of your control. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of a weird thing. Yes, we can take charge of our beliefs and desires. We can say that they're not out of our control right now. But whether or not you're the kind of person that will actually take the time to do that, well, that's an open question, isn't it? Some of you, yes, may do that. Some of you may not. It depends on what kind of person you already are right now. And even there, you've shaped yourself a little bit. You've made lots of choices that impacted what kind of environment you're in, right? So you could do this metacognition and you could realize people who are drug addicts, for example, often have to do that, right? They have to think environmentally. They have to think there's this environmental trigger. If I go to the same old places and hang out with the same old friends, then I'm going to keep doing those drugs, right? So you could be the kind of person that says, okay, then I'm going to get off drugs. I'm not going to go to those places anymore. I'm not going to hang out with those people anymore. To that extent, you are overcoming your training and your previous beliefs and desires. But are you the drug addict that does that? Or are you the drug addict that does not do that? Right? That is ultimately depends on what kind of person you are, what your psychological makeup is. And again, your psychological makeup can, in some very strong sense, be traced back to what kind of wiring you had to begin with and what kind of life-forming circumstances you had growing up. None of that means that if XYZ happens, then this must happen, right? None of this is to say, well, if you were born into a poor, abusive household, you will never amount to anything. None of it, it's not saying any of that. It's not saying anything like that. It's not saying you are determined to be one way for the rest of your life. It's not saying that either. It just means that in some ultimate sense, it is out of your control. It is not your choice what kind of person you were to begin with. Right? But the kind of person you were to begin with will determine what kind of person you will become. See? So yeah, I already said this, but so in the very first statement here, I said all conscious, intentional behavior can be explained by your beliefs and your desires. And your beliefs and desires are ultimately out of your control. Right? And I had said, saying ultimately, right? I have to qualify this whole statement. And this is how we're qualifying it. Look, you can change your beliefs and desires. You can. But whether you do so and how you decide to do it is still going to depend on what kind of person you are when you make that decision, what your character is. And what kind of character you have is going to be determined by your genetic makeup and your personal history. In other words, what are you like right now? Well, you can understand what you're like by talking about your genetic makeup and the life experiences that you've had. Yes, and some of those life experiences were ones that you chose, but why did you choose those life experiences? Well, it's because of the kind of person you were when you made that choice. Why were you that kind of person when you made that choice? Well, because of your previous experiences and the way that you're genetically wired and predisposed. You see how we can keep doing this, and ultimately we just get back to you were a person born into the world without any say into what kind of person you're going to be, what kind of genetic makeup you're going to have, what kind of environment you're going to be put in, what your life circumstances are going to look like growing up. You have no control over any of these things, and those are all the things that ultimately are going to explain your psychological profile. Okay, see this? So it's subtle. I want to make sure I don't just have a very stupid version of psychological determinism. This creates a lot of room for self-improvement, right? And it doesn't mean that you must be a drug addict forever or that you must be a criminal forever if you had a bad childhood. It doesn't mean any of those things. That's sort of stupid psychological determinism. It doesn't mean that. On this view, you can still improve your lot in life. It's just that in the final reckoning of things, if you do that, you're just sort of lucky. Right? It means you had some sort of environmental inputs that maybe change your outlook on life, that you were able to flip things, or perhaps you were always your natural predisposition based on your genetics maybe is to be a positive kind of person who's always looking for something good, even if you grew up in bad circumstances. Right? Yeah, there's all sorts of ways of getting out of that, but in the ultimate reckoning of things, it's going to be a matter of luck whether you do that or not. Yeah, so it's hard to think about. And again, I've tried to not use the word free will too much here, right? I'm trying to not use that word to describe psychological determinism. So all we're really saying here is, this is saying that you can make choices based on your desires, right? So if that's all that free will is, that's not a problem, right? It's just that your desires are ultimately caused by something outside of yourself. So, in other words, whether free will is true or not, nobody's saying anything about that here. This simply says determinism is true. The choices you make are based on your personality, your psychological profile. Your personality, psychological profile is an end result of what kind of physical being you are and the kind of environment that you have interacted with. Okay? So we can go back to the Westworld robots to think about this, right? Remember the Westworld robots, the show Westworld, where you have these hyper-realistic robots who are indistinguishable from flesh and blood human beings. They're all unique as well, right? They all have a unique bodies that they were given, unique software implemented in the hardware that they were given, and then they each have their unique life experiences in that artificial Westworld, right? They interact with one another in ways that each robot can't predict or anything like that. They're programmed to be just like human beings, right? You are just like that, basically, right? Those Westworld robots have a certain limited amount of software written into them, but then a lot of the rest of their behavior is going to be determined by their circumstances, by what they experience. It doesn't mean that the robots can't do something spontaneous and unique. They do. These robots do, and it makes sense that they do, because they have unique experiences, and that might result in things that are, to each individual one of us, without the mind of a god, right, might not be able to predict how these robots are going to behave. Just like we can't predict how one another will behave. But it's the same basic story here, right? That we are kind of like those robots. And again, those robots don't seem like your ordinary robot, right? And they can talk about their intentions, and they can talk about all that. We can explain their behavior in terms of what those robots want and what they think about the world. We do all the same sort of folk psychology to the robots as we do to us. But we can see pretty clearly that in the robots' case, even though they're engaging in behavior that seems like free will behavior, we know that they are just programmed in some ultimate sense, right? They're programmed with the software and then programmed by life experiences. Okay, I wanted to bring that up because sometimes when people hear program, it automatically means something very rigid and robotic, right? But if we notice that people's initial programming is different already because of your different DNA, and also people's life experiences are unique. So on that view, of course, your behavior is going to, in many cases, be unique, spontaneous, unpredictable. Does not mean that it was not determined. So your behavior could be completely determined, even though we're not evil. We're not a Laplace's demon. We can't predict the future, right? But if you knew enough about the physical circumstances of the world, then yes, you would know exactly how you're going to behave based on your psychological profile or based on your brain states or something like that. Okay, good so far. Any questions? We'll be done pretty soon here. We're going a little bit over time. You get the basic idea? Hopefully. Psychological determinism. Yeah. Okay. Argument 4. This is actually, I don't know that anyone ever formalized this as an argument. I came up with this myself because I've thought about this quite a bit. If determinism isn't true, what would the alternative look like? Right? So we're trying to decide, is determinism true? We looked at 3 basic arguments here. Here's another argument. Well, let's suppose that it wasn't true. What would the world be like? Well, then there would be uncaused events. Right? There would be stuff that just happened out of nowhere. That's what indeterminism would look like. That's the opposite of determinism. Events that just happen without cause. In other words, some things just happen, but there's no causal explanation. We can't say, oh, that happened because of this and this. That's what indeterminism would look like. And it would also mean that we can explain your intentional behavior in a way that does not ultimately reduce to your genetics and your environment. Which, that one you might not think is a problem. Right? You might think that that's true. But again, listen to the argument from psychology, right? And just folk psychology as well. Think about your own behavior and how your own behavior is the result of who you are as a person. But who you are as a person is ultimately determined, explained by your life experiences and the kind of temperament that you have at birth that you are given by your genetics. So on that sense, that would be strange as well. But if that one you're not sure about, look at the first two. Does the world look like that? Does it seem as though there's just all sorts of stuff that happens without any causal explanation? I don't think it looks like that. So it's a kind of an indirect argument for determinism. It doesn't look like indeterminism is true. If indeterminism were true, we'd have all this stuff happening without any kind of possible explanation. The world doesn't seem to be like that. Notice also, now this is going to come up again later, is indeterminism really good for free will? With free will, they're supposed to, your behavior, the event of your action is supposed to be the result of your choice. Now, if we're saying there's indeterminism would mean that there's a lack of a causal connection somewhere. So it would either mean that your behavior wasn't caused by your desire. Well, that's not free will. Or it would mean that your desires and your beliefs about the world are not causally connected to your life experiences and your genetic wiring at all. That doesn't seem to be the case either. So indeterminism does not seem to be true. Right? But we'll look at some possible exceptions. And indeterminism does not actually seem to help free will when you really think about it. It's kind of funny because determinism is supposed to look like it's the enemy of free will, or at least potentially, and that's how people usually interpret it. But the more you think about this issue, I find that indeterminism is much worse. If indeterminism were true, I think we'd be much worse off, but we'll see about that later. Let's see. Okay, for now that'll do. Okay, so just to quickly look at the overall structure again. Okay, we looked at free will, some of the things that we associate with free will actions, right? Things like you're choosing from among different options. Nobody's forcing you to do it. The action is the result of your own intention or desire to do the action, and you could have done otherwise. Where you could have done otherwise has these two possible interpretations. Right? And then the tie between free will and morality, right? That's whether or not someone is morally praiseworthy or blameworthy depends on whether they did the action of their own free will. Right? And then the idea of determinism, right? And determinism is supposed to be this sort of problematic idea for free will, such that some people are worried that if determinism is true, then we don't have free will, and therefore morality goes out the window as well. You see how that works? It's sort of like okay, well, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. If we don't have free will, then we don't have any kind of morality. We can't have moral responsibility or anything like that. So that's what's at stake here, supposedly. The worry is that if determinism is true, then we don't have free will, and moral claims are all kind of bogus because there's no such thing as moral responsibility on that view. So that's the worry. So then we're going to explore that. We're going to explore whether that's correct or not, right? Is determinism really incompatible with free will or not? So we'll look at the different options, and that's what we'll do on Thursday. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can let me know. Otherwise, you are free to go, and I will see you on Thursday.